Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you very much, Wendy, and your team for adjusting to my schedule and allowing me to leave soon. And apologies to all of you. I don't normally do this, but I did have commitments already made. I'm happy to be able to join you, even though very, very briefly, because I think on the one hand, you're addressing some of the most serious issues of our time. But these issues and their responses are changing too. We have environmental emergencies that are quite clearly emergencies. They're recognized as emergencies. The Bhopal disaster, the Chernobyl disaster, the disaster after the tsunami and the earthquake in Japan. But they're also silent emergencies, which are taking their toll on ecosystems, on people. But because they don't come concentrated in space and time, there isn't the same kind of response. You have a flood, you can see the flooding, you can see homes being washed away. But a drought also displaces. A drought also kills. But the drought doesn't ever have the same kind of response, because it kills silently. And floods and droughts, as we know, are no more purely natural disasters. We can't call them natural disasters anymore, because they're intensified and become more frequent with the contributions of climate uncertainty and climate chaos. So we're talking about environmental emergencies in a time of higher vulnerability, higher environmental vulnerability, higher community vulnerability, but also a higher vulnerability of agencies like yours that respond to these emergencies and these disasters. And those are the three aspects that I will touch on in my brief remarks before you go deeper into these discussions. I've been working on ecological issues in my country now for 4 decades. And in 1984, I was invited by the government of Maharashtra. And they said, we keep responding to the water crisis. We pour more and more money into getting water to people. And yet, we're always in a deeper crisis. So I said, okay, I'll try and figure out. And it wasn't that every year was a meteorological drought with rainfall failure, but every year was a soil drought. It was a water drought. It was an aquifer drought, because in a land where you get 600 millimeters of rainfall and the kind of geology, which is the Deccan Trap, you have only 10% infiltration into the ground. That means there's only 60 millimeters available annually for water use. And yet in this area, sugarcane was promoted, which needs 1,200 millimeters. So you can imagine that in no time a water famine was being created. And this had now gone from a temporary emergency of the year when the rainfall fails to a permanent emergency when even in years when the rainfall is normal. Now, Maharashtra is not a sugarcane area. The area where I come from, it's the Ganges Basin, is where sugarcane evolved. We used to have forests of sugarcane. And that's where it was domesticated. And that's where sugar was given to the world. Maharashtra is a land where, 600 millimeters anyway, the most popular crop was millets. Now, millets is a family of crops that are forgotten foods. Most people don't know what are millets. They ask, what is a millet? They think it's only bird food now. But millets get their name because each seed gives you 1 million seeds. Tiny grains, 7 species, lots of diversity. Most of Africa's arid zones cultivate millets. Most of India's arid and semi-arid tracts cultivate millet. The mountain areas where I come from, in the Himalaya, we cultivate millet. And over the years, as I have done seed saving through Navdanya, I've grown very fond of millets. They take 250 millimeters of water, So even a bad year of drought, they'll give you food. And they give you 40 times more nutrition than rice and wheat. So with water limitations, which is the most serious limitation, because in fact, land is not limited, but cultivable land gets limited because of lack of water. With water as a limiting factor, we could literally grow 400 times more food if we focus on millets. But somewhere along the way, they've started to get called inferior grains, backward crops. And I've never found a good explanation for this, except maybe some kind of a racism about food, where even our food must be white. White flour, white sugar, white salt, white bread, polished rice. But just as it is between people, black is beautiful. In food too, black is beautiful, and is vital to be able to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience. As we have evolved strategies for dealing with climate vulnerability, for example, these forgotten foods are becoming future foods. I started to save seeds 26 years ago, and interestingly, because of a meeting at the other end of this corridor, where we were starting to look at what are biotechnologies, the issue of intellectual property rights. At that point, the Uruguay round of GATT was being negotiated. And once I heard about what was going on, I said, this is all I'll do the rest of my life. Save seeds and defend the integrity of diversity. Now, over the years, we've both done very deeply scientific work, but also just work with communities. Diverse systems don't fail. If you grow 12 crops in a field, 9 will do well, 3 might fail. But if you have only one monoculture that needs exactly that much water, and you don't have enough rain, you have a total crop failure. So reducing vulnerability means increasing diversity. But reducing vulnerability also means increasing the capacity of ecosystems overall to deal with the kind of deeper environmental emergencies of the silent kind that are being created by a deepening climate crisis. I don't have to go through the figures with you. You have a higher frequency, higher velocity, higher intensity of cyclones and hurricanes. You have higher frequency, intensity, and extension of droughts, and you have higher intensity and frequency of floods. Our work has shown that 40% of all greenhouse gases are coming from a system of agriculture that also makes agriculture and land use more vulnerable to climate instability. So the contributing factor is also a higher vulnerability factor. And in agriculture, a large amount of the greenhouse gases come from chemical fertilizers, because nitrogen oxide is 300 times more damaging to the climate than carbon dioxide. Comes from concentration of animal production and increasing of waste, the methane issue, and then, of course, with long-distance transport, as well as in the whole production cycle, carbon dioxide. So 40% of the climate problem is coming from a non-sustainable way of producing food. And the entire Kyoto Protocol period was focusing on a 5% reduction. But we could have a 40% reduction while increasing resilience of communities as well as ecosystems to be able to deal with the new environmental emergencies of climate change. But related to this is the fact that not only is the climate damage huge, 75% of all of the silent environmental emergencies are related to an industrialized form of farming. The UN had organized a conference in 1995. It was called the Plant Genetic Resources Conference, where the FAO took assessments of how much biodiversity erosion have we had. And in 1995, it was already 75% of biodiversity gone because of industrial monocultures. only grow one crop. And at this point, the only expansion of 4 crops: soya, corn, canola, and cotton. Because these are the genetically modified crops that are related to a patent collection, a royalty collection. And so there's a pressure for the expansion. Is this biodiversity decrease increasing the capacity to respond to emergencies? No, because only 10% of corn and soya is going into the human food system, eaten directly by humans. A large part is going for biofuels. The canola that's growing in Europe is not being eaten. We eat mustard, but this canola is for biofuel. And a large part for animal feed. And the reason herbivores were called herbivores was because they didn't eat grain, they ate grass. And yet their diet has been changed because it works for rapid increase in meat and milk or whatever has to be produced. So we are no more talking about a food system. Water depletion. Industrial agriculture, chemical farming is the single biggest depleter of water. Countries like mine, 95% goes to intensive irrigation for chemical farming. And the water that comes out then creates its further problems of chemical runoff into the oceans, dead zones. UNEP is the one that's been monitoring these dead zones in the ocean. And soil degradation. And the soil degradation comes from the fact that you're allowing your biodiversity in the soil, which is 1/3 of the biodiversity on the planet, to be depleted. Now, no matter which treaty we look at and which agreement we look at, or Millennium Development, no matter which part of the UN system you look at one way or the other, it's being impacted by these sets of activities. The Bhopal disaster, which is recognized as an environmental emergency, on the one hand, goes hand in hand with 2 silent emergencies that are growing. Half of US farmlands are overtaken by superweeds. I call that a silent emergency, your capacity to grow food. Now, if that happens in the third world, where a community totally depends on what it grows for its food needs, you've already got a very huge problem in terms of food production. And what is necessary is to be able to both reduce these causes that are increasing the vulnerability while increasing the resilience. And fortunately, the same steps contribute to both. The same steps contribute to mitigation of climate change and better adaptability to climate change. Now, food intervention is one of the biggest responses of humanitarian aid. Medicine, of course, also, but food is the basic. And yet the capacity to deliver is being put into a very, very difficult situation for 2 sets of reasons. The first is what I mentioned in terms of patenting of seed. Now, if climate vulnerability is increasing, then you need to have more diversity of seed and you need to have more access to seed in order to be able to deal with agriculture after a flood. Agriculture after a cyclone. In Afghania, we have taken truckloads of seed to distribute it after the tsunami of South India or the cyclone of Orissa, but it's because we have those seeds in the commons. Climate resilience is one of the highest, is the candidate for patenting. It's not that you can engineer climate resilience, it's too complex a trait, but you can take a patent because there's a phenomenon I've talked about and written about and fought called biopiracy. You just take what exists and say invention, put a stamp and say invention. Now, the climate resilient crops that have been evolved by community are now being patented, 1,500 patents in the hands of the 5 giants that now control the seed. So you can imagine a community gets knocked out with a flood or a cyclone, and they need seeds after the disaster to plant, or agencies need seed to distribute, but it's patented. Day before, the Supreme Court of the US ruled on a very famous case called Bowman versus Monsanto. I won't go into the details for lack of time. But we're talking about something like $1 trillion a year for patent royalties if the system carries on. Now, can you imagine how much money agencies would need to have in order to make the seed supply happen? So at a time when the need to respond is growing, the capacity to respond goes down. And the same is happening with the food issue. While we have a growing vulnerability of the food system, you also have higher speculation. So the prices are shooting up. And after all the humanitarian aid eventually depends on getting food from the market. So if speculation is making prices rise, because now food is a speculative commodity, especially after 2008, after the collapse of Wall Street on the subprime crisis, now land, which is the big land grab issue in Africa particularly, and food become the two big speculative commodities with chains of 25% returns for every level of investment. So how do we deal then, at this point of time, with a resilient system from the level of the ecosystem, the community, countries, and the global community? I think the first thing we really have to rethink is our relationship with the earth, because that's where vulnerability grows. I mean, I have done conferences in Japan after the tsunami, and that's the challenge, saying we have to redefine how we relate to the earth, because this idea of conquest is leading to higher vulnerability. After the tsunami in South India, when I went and I was working with the women, and besides the fact that we took salt-tolerant seeds, when I asked them, what do you really want for rehabilitation? And they gave me a Tamil word, which was then translated to mean seeds of trees that caress the angry waves. This is how they describe the mangroves. Trees that caress the angry waves. Now, you can think of that if you were still thinking of conquest. Then you think of building seawalls and everything else that also came up at that time. I think the second very important issue, especially with environmental emergencies of the kind that are related to nuclear, chemicals, etc., is building a robust structure, again in the UN, on technology assessment, to have risk reduction. After all, preparedness means also taking paths that reduce risks. There used to be an Office of Technology Assessment, and somewhere along the way it was closed as offices of National Technology Assessment were closed, but never before have we needed technology assessment as deeply, especially at a time where suddenly you get ideas that you need to reflect the sun back for a global cooling geoengineering. And there are 3 young men who want to create glowing plants. They're putting firefly genes into plants. We'll be able to read with our plants. You do need to bring sanity back into the system. And you do need a more collective responsibility about this. And I think part of this collective responsibility is to understand and define what belongs to the commons and the public good. Because there cannot be a system that reduces vulnerability and is able to respond fully if we do not have spaces for the public good, spaces for that which is the commons. And the care for humanity and the care for the earth needs this very desperately. But in any case, we need it because our ability to be able to respond will depend very much on how much access public systems have to public goods in order to respond. Thank you so much for your patience, and apologies again. And now I will rush to be able to catch my flight.